Chances are, if you've taken even a few courses on the topic of music theory, you've come across Roman numeral analysis. Seeing as most Western music courses teach theory using this system of analysis to explain music, most people just assume this system has always been part of music theory. It doesn't matter if it's Bach or Beethoven, the system is used everywhere. So imagine my shock many years back when I discovered Roman numerals were a fairly new theoretical invention. And even more shocking was the fact that composers like Beethoven or Bach learned music theory without ever being aware of Roman numeral analysis. So my question is, if the masterful works of Bach or Beethoven can be written without any knowledge of Roman numeral analysis, why are we all forced to learn it? To start off with, music theory is not nearly as universally agreed upon at any point in time as, say, theories in mathematical and scientific fields are. When Isaac Newton, for example, developed calculus, he proved his idea and the scientific community accepted his proofs, and as such, we still use his differential equations to this very day. Of course, Newton's ideas would later be challenged by Einstein as to whether time was a constant unchanging variable, but nevertheless, Newton's theories were not burned to the ground, but rather adapted upon. Comparatively, music theory today is a chaotic mess. Between jazz musicians, pop musicians, and amongst classical musicians, you are bound to hear many different theoretical ways of understanding music. I've had several theory teachers through the years, and none of them would have agreed on much of anything if they all sat down at the same table and discussed theory with one another. Comparatively, in math courses, the fundamentals are for the most part universally agreed upon, and I'd suppose a discussion amongst science teachers on basic fundamentals would be far more civil. Why is this? How can there be so much disagreement on something that, for the most part, seems like it should be pretty much standardized and settled at this point? I might have some insight on this, which I will get to later, but first some background on the origins of this system. Roman numeral analysis owes its existence and popularity to the theoretical works of Gottfried Weber, who based his theories off the less popular theoretical works of Joseph Vogler, who himself had employed Roman numerals as early as the 1770s. Nonetheless, the system remained in obscurity until Gottfried Weber wrote his influential theoretical book Versuch einer geordneten Theorie der Tonsetzkunst, known in English as A Theory of Composition, which was first published in German in 1817. This is fascinating to me, as every composer before Weber's theories didn't employ Roman numerals, as they obviously weren't conceived of yet. Throughout the 19th century, Weber's theory would be expanded upon, reaching more or less their modern form, and expanded upon in the theoretical works of Hugo Riemann, who at the end of the 19th century would coin terms such as dominant and subdominant. So once again, consider the fact that the theory we all learn in school is a mix of many theories developed in the 19th century, with some small holdovers from earlier theoretical books. By the 20th century, Weber and Riemann's theoretical ideas became the universal norm amongst classical music theory courses in schools and universities. And even if the systems they developed show their limitations when the music being analyzed became more complex, it nevertheless became the standard system with which composers who didn't use the system themselves were analyzed. I think this might have to do with the centralization of music education. See, up until the middle to late 19th century, music composition was taught very differently than it is now. Like with many Western arts or trades, be it masonry, metallurgy, architecture, painting, sculpting, and so on, compositional training revolved around a master and apprentice relationship. This led to many of the finer aspects of music theory being passed on via word of mouth or recorded in obscure books, many of which were written in Latin, which was the European language of education up until the 17th century. This obviously kept the knowledge of how to compose amongst a privileged few. Weber and Riemann developed systems to explain the finer aspects of composition, but did so in a way which was probably unbeknownst to them, understandable to the masses, and was easy to fit into a music curriculum. It is for this very reason, in my opinion, that their systems became the standard among music theory courses. So how did composers like Beethoven or Bach learn to compose if they didn't have this supposedly indispensable system of analysis at their disposal? The answer is they used other systems, mainly two systems, these being thorough bass and counterpoint. These two systems are incredibly rich in their artistic possibilities. But in order to keep this video from being 5 hours long, I will try to explain as rudimentary as possible why I have found these two systems more useful when I personally compose. When composing, a lot of what is achieved comes down to sudden bursts of creativity. And when you're composing and the ideas are flowing, you need to internalize systems that lend themselves to quick thinking. If you're constantly thinking about degrees and harmonic functions, you are not free to explore. Thorough bass and counterpoint reduce music to intervallic relationships, which in their application alternate heavily between tension and resolution, something almost entirely absent from Roman numeral analysis. And when music is reduced in the way they are in these systems, everything begins to appear related. Scales and degrees begin to meld into one another. For example, G sharp isn't strictly G sharp anymore, since the interval it's paired with only determines if it's G sharp, as it might enharmonically be A flat if it's paired with a C or an F, as opposed to a B or an E. And if you understand anything about modulation, you might realize how liberating that can be. This is why classical composers modulate constantly through several keys without it being jarring to the listener. Take a look at any work by Johann Sebastian Bach, who himself effortlessly glides from one key signature to another. I am aware thorough bass and counterpoint are covered in music courses, but for the most part they are rushed and only briefly mentioned compared to Roman numeral analysis, which is a shame since composers used to employ thorough bass and contrapunctal patterns which had been developed and refined over centuries all the time in their own pieces. And if you look hard enough, you can find these patterns and sequences almost everywhere. It's the same for computer programmers who use bits of tried and true code to fill in the blanks of what they are writing themselves. They might not have created that bit of code themselves, but they know it's what's needed to get from one execution to the next. These patterns were mostly conveyed with Arabic numerals, such as 6363 or 5353. And believe it or not, simple sequences like these are in the DNA of some of the greatest passages of classical music. I will expand on and outline some of these classical music patterns in future videos, as any single one would be a 10 to 15 minute topic on their own. Don't get me wrong, Roman numeral analysis is not bad. There is no harm in understanding the degrees and harmonic function of a scale or key signature, so that you know what key signatures your chords are in and where certain harmonies can take you. But that's all I've found it good for. I just feel it's too strict, limited, and rigid when one gets around to composing their own music. But that's just my opinion, which brings me back to what I stated towards the beginning of this video, which was if all my former theory teachers sat down at a table, they would have all disagreed with each other about many aspects of music theory. But it just so happens that they were all composers themselves, and they all had very different opinions on how to best compose and understand music. This is probably because composition is extremely personal, and over the course of one's compositional studies, one develops their own ways of doing things. Take this video merely as advice, and my advice would be if you are just starting to get into music theory, look for old theoretical works online. You'd be surprised the amount of theoretical works available for free, be it through Google or the Petrucci Library. So find out who taught your favorite composer or who their pupils were, and try to find out if they wrote any theoretical books themselves. You might be surprised what new perspectives and hidden knowledge awaits you. But most important of all, look at how composers write their music. You will learn the most by reading lots and lots of scores, as opposed to reading the theories of lesser men. As sometimes it's best to just let the music speak for itself.